Well, thank you, Rebecca. Well, good morning, everybody. It's 11 o'clock, so it's still technically morning. So thank you for joining us. This is part 2 of my 3-part series I'm doing on the Industrial General Stormwater Permit, or as it's been abbreviated, the IGP permit. Anybody who missed the first one, the first presentation, it'll be up on our website a little bit later, I think within 24 hours or so. And you can go and you can catch up and see that one. And then this one here, the previous one was talking about where the permit came from. Why do we have it? Who requires coverage? And this one is going to talk about, okay, now that you're here, now that you're in the permit, this one's going to talk about what do I need to do? What is the permit asking me to do? So that's why I have it as the subtitle. Now that it's understood that the Industrial General Stormwater Permit is, what does the IGP require of me, of my facility? Okay. Well, first of all, they're not going to ask you for your firstborn, but it sometimes may feel like that. I understand. So let's take it one step at a time. By the way, once again, feel free to use the chat, everybody. Rebecca is an excellent help, and she'll help keep me on. If there's questions in the chat, she'll break in and let me know. And please feel free to break in with questions or whatever. Also, you can unmute and ask questions. That's fine. During the presentation, I'm going to try to finish that way. At the end of the presentation, we can have a chance for back and forth questions. In the meantime, you can use the chat during the presentation. Feel free to do so, and I'll bring it to my attention and answer it best I can. So, in the previous one, we talked about the Industrial General Stormwater Permit. We talked about the fact that we were talking about Section 10, basically covered in our last one. This time we're going to talk about sections 11 and then just briefly touch on Section 12. This is not going to be a treatise on the compliance options. That's a whole other workshop in and of itself. But basically we're just going to touch lightly on it. So right now we're talking on Section 11 of the General Permit. Now, like I showed everybody else last time, this is my copy of the General Permit. And basically this much of it here is a permit. The bottom half is my support documents and stuff I've done over the years. I call my compliance Bible. As you can see, it's huge. But basically, this section here of it, this is all right here. That's all permit. That's all permit right there. So that's why basically people say, well, I have my stormwater pollution prevention plan, my SWEP. This is my permit. Well, technically, no. That's your binder. That's your SWEP, which tells everybody how you plan to comply with the permit requirements. Okay, so we're going to talk about Section 11, which is monitoring. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about definitions, because sometimes what a regulatory body will say and what's normal for everybody else may be different, or maybe they'll have a misunderstanding. So discharge is what? When people say what's discharge, it's water or fluid that leaves your property. Okay, so discharge is if it leaves your property, it's a discharge. If it goes to the waters of the United States, now, technically speaking, if it leaves your property and you're in an area that doesn't go to the waters of the United States, it's not necessarily considered a discharge under the permit. But I don't think anybody within the hearing of this program will comply with that. So, from 99% of people who are, especially if you're under general permit coverage, if water leaves your property, it's a discharge. Okay. Point of discharge, or what many of us for years called outfalls, is the point at which water leaves. Impound or containment is where you hold on to your water. The water board really likes you to hold on to your water if you can, for a couple of reasons. One, if you have any built up pollutants or dust, whatever, it's captured there. It doesn't go off site, because if water leaves your property, it goes to the rivers, streams, it goes to the lakes. It doesn't go to a treatment plant. So that's why if you can capture water and have it soak back into the ground and recharge the water table, that's optimal. Okay, without, of course, contaminated groundwater. We're talking about just water that makes it into the ground and it helps to recharge the water table. And two, if you can contain your water, that'd be great for you, because you're not required to grab a sample unless you're discharged, and we'll talk about that. So let's move on the slides to we'll keep going. Let's talk about observations or inspections. Okay, there are two types under this general permit. You're supposed to do monthly visual observations or inspections, and then you're supposed to do stormwater observations. Okay, So in terms of documented inspections, there's two ones that the permit requires. One is monthly and one is stormwater observations. And of these two, we'll talk about those differences and what triggers them. And then we're going to talk about sampling. We're going to talk about how to sample, where to sample, a little bit. We're going to talk about the sampling requirements in terms of when you're supposed to sample. Now, the protocols for sampling, you'll want to stay tuned for the 1:30 workshop. We're going to talk about the proper protocols for sampling, and also we're going to look at a video that WGR helped the Water Board create, which talks about stormwater sampling, and it'll be for those who have to collect samples. It'd be highly recommended that you do your tools at that third one. So let's take a look at this one. So let's first talk about monthly visual observations or sampling. It needs to be conducted a minimum of once per calendar month. Now, I think I touched on later, but the stormwater year is not the same as the calendar year. The stormwater year starts July 1st and ends June 30th. Okay, starts July 1st, ends June 30th. So we are now in the 2021-2022 monitoring or reporting year. Okay, we are now in so we have July, August, September. We just finished the first 3 months, the first quarter of this, and now we're into the second quarter of this monitoring year. Okay, so that comes into play later. So but for monthly inspections, you're required to do once a month. Okay, now you're supposed to do them during daylight operating hours. So if you're a facility that's open 24/7, you can't do these inspections in the middle of the night. Well, I mean, you can, but they won't be compliant. It has to be done when the sun's up, and it has to be on a day without precipitation. Okay, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, you're looking for a couple of things. One is non-stormwater, and if you have rain, how do you know what's non-stormwater and what's rainwater? So, to recap, it needs to be conducted a minimum of at least once per calendar month. Has to be done on a day during the daylight hours, during rain, and needs to be done on a day without precipitation. Okay, it has to be a dry day. That's why many times people refer to this as dry weather inspections. I had one weird case, just one, where in the morning it hadn't rained for months. It was like in October, and we had a whole summer without rain, and we were doing monthly inspections for a client. And I got there, we did the inspections in the morning, and then later on that afternoon, a freak storm blew in off the coast, and it hit real hard right in the area, and we ended up getting the sample. And so it was like, wait a minute, I thought you were supposed to, well, at that point, it was a day without rain. It was one of the weirdest situations normally it would have. So, but it counted because at that point, it had been no rain. So what are you supposed to look for in this monthly observations? Well, you're supposed to look for non-stormwater discharges, okay? Stuff other than stormwater, okay? And also you're supposed to inspect areas for exposed stormwater and review your status of your BMPs. So one of the reasons they want you to do this on a monthly basis is at least once a month, you go in and make sure your BMPs are in place. And if you remember from those who were joining us for part one, BMPs, by definition, of things that you do or things that you build to reduce or eliminate pollutants in stormwater, okay? So that's a very broad term. So when you walk around, if you see the places that absolute disaster and no one's done clean it up, then then they're not doing their BMPs because they haven't swept on a regular basis as they should have. Again, the permit is a general permit. It's not going to tell you have to sweep 5 times a day. But if you see that there's a need for it, you need to sweep as often as long as your numbers are good, your BMPs are effective. So I have one former client where they would do a lot of wood cutting, and they had several shifts. And what they would do is, at the end of each shift, they would take the last 15 minutes to clean up the area. Every shift. So I mean, that was the most extreme case I saw of good housekeeping. The place looked great. As a rule, and it's because every shift, everybody turned into good housekeeping clerks, and everybody cleaned the place up. Other people, I've had it where they sweep once a month, and their numbers are fine. Their BMPs are catching it, their numbers are good. So it depends. You know, it's up to you. As long as your stormwater numbers when you grab samples are good, you're fine. Inspecting areas exposed to stormwater and reviewing the status of your BMPs. So that's what I'm talking about. So first one is, do we have any stuff other than stormwater leaving? And then there's stuff that's allowed to leave, stuff that's not allowed to leave. Certain stormwater, like irrigation, other things are allowed to leave. but then they want you to minimize it. I can go in more detail in my full training. I go into more detail as to what's allowed and what's not allowed. And also there's strings attached to those. Okay. You can't just let water leave, even non-storm water. It's supposed to be trying to minimize it if possible. And it needs to leave relatively clean. And we'll talk about that in more detail if I have a chance. One thing you're supposed to look for is you need to look for indications of prior, current, or potential unauthorized non-storm discharges, or even authorized for that matter. Okay. If you walk around and you see splaining leaving your property, that means something left. You need to track down what it was, what left. Can you plug the hole? That's why you're supposed to walk the perimeter. You know, is water coming into my property? Is water leaving my property from a place that we didn't realize? If water's leaving your property, that's now an outfall. It needs to be sampled during a rainstorm unless you plug it up and redirect it to your regular outfall. So there's things to consider. Two, if the water is authorized, okay, what is it? If it's not authorized, what do we need to do to fix it? Okay. Remember, the general permit has conditions for authorized non-storm discharge. You get to have irrigation or fountain drinking water or potable water, just leave and you don't have to worry about it. No, it has to leave relatively clean. And there's a whole set of conditions that are outlined in Section 4 of the permit. So you need to inspect outdoor areas and equipment and storage areas and activities, BMPs, and other potential sources of pollutants. So when you walk around once a month, look at stuff. Okay, they want you to think through your program. They want you to take a look at stuff. Okay, wait a minute. Are we doing our sweeping? Okay, wait a minute. Are we doing our maintenance on our? You know, if we're doing our maintenance, take a look at your spill kits. Are my spill kits filled? Are they good to go in case there's a spill? Okay, I have a cover. Okay, I have a roof. Okay, is this roof good? Is it advanced BMP? Okay, is there a hole in the roof? Okay, we need to follow up. Don't be afraid to document something you find. Okay, because if you do, you're showing regulators, hey, I did a real inspection. I walked around. I saw this. Now, the key is making sure to document the resolution to the issue you found. So don't write a problem down and then don't write down its resolution. So, for example, say you say, oh, well, we have a berm and there's a hole in the berm. What you do is get it patched and say, okay, hole was patched on this day and this time. And what you're doing is you're not getting yourself in trouble. What you're getting is you're getting proof that you did a real inspection, that you walked around. You said, look, we walked around. Here's what we did. Here's what we found. And it's okay. And we responded to it. You found your problem and you fixed it. So you maintained compliance. You didn't leave compliance. You actually maintained compliance. And by documenting stuff and then documenting the resolution to it, remember, that's important, the resolution. When you document both of those, you're actually covering yourself and proving that you're doing what you're supposed to do. So let's talk about sampling them. So to recap, there's a whole list of authorized. My other full training, I talk about authorized stormwater and some of the conditions. I can't go into it because we have a limited time in this format, but I talk about all the different things that's allowed to discharge. And then I talk about some of the caveats, some of the rules that go along with it. And basically those two rules real quick before we move on to sampling. There's two overarching things, and I can break them down, but bottom line is it has to leave relatively clean. And two, they want you to try to minimize it as much as possible. Yeah, so you have authorized non-stormwater. It's allowed to discharge as long as you document it. But if you can capture it or if you can keep it from leaving, that's best. I have a client in South Lake Tahoe area, and they, for the first time this year, it didn't have a natural spring, but every year I go out there, even in drought years, there's a natural spring that comes up on their property and it flows off site. They have no control over that. It flows 365 and leap year 366 times a year, okay? All the time, except for this year. This year I went out there to do an evaluation back in, I believe it was June, and the natural spring was actually dried up. So that tells you we must have had a really severe drought year this past year to have even that place. I mean, back in the 5-year, 6-year drought we had a couple years ago, it was still flowing. So anyway, so normally what they do is, but because they had no control over the central spring, they would basically, they can't mitigate the amount leaving the property. It's a natural spring. So what they do is they basically say, to the extent feasible, remember that language, to the extent feasible from our previous section? If you haven't seen it, you need to go see it. It'll be on the website by next week. But so they just document the fact that, yeah, we had a non-stormwater discharge, but it's clean and we have no reason to believe it's dirty. So they follow those two things. One, it left relatively clean, and it's fine. So moving on to sample event visual observations. Okay, when do you need to conduct a sample? They need to be done at each discharge location during sampling. So you only have to do a sample event evaluation when you're having a sampling event. Okay, and we're going to talk about when you're supposed to sample. That's coming up. And make sure the inspections include all the required information in the follow-up necessary. So we at WGR, we actually created forms that include all the information that you need to make sure you document. One thing that's not officially in the permit, but I find that a lot of regulators have asked me about, is to document your pH on your chain of custody. It's not required in the permit to say you have to put your pH in your chain of custody, but it does say you're required to test for pH within the first 15 minutes of collecting your sample. Okay, that is a permit requirement. So what a lot of my clients do is when they're grabbing their samples and they're filling out their chain of custody, you know, that paper that goes along with your samples to the lab, when they're collecting, when they're documenting when they took their pH levels, they document on the chain of custody directly their field results for their pH. And I would highly recommend that, because I've had regulators before, a couple times, ask me, hey, I don't see the pH in your chain. Can you please send me their paper? So then we have to send them a separate documentation showing the pH. So you save yourself a headache, and it makes it easier. Plus, say if somebody else, like a consultant like myself, processes your stormwater discharge, your ad hoc reports, if you have the pH on there, it's on there for them. They don't have to hunt it down or get that from you. Qualifying storm events. Okay, now here's where we get into the meat of it. Okay, what qualifies as a storm that allows you to grab samples? Okay, not every storm that comes by is a storm that's qualified to collect samples, compliant sampling. Some storms don't. But what does? Well, a storm that's qualified to collect samples or qualifying storm event has to produce a discharge or flow for at least one drainage area. And the water board a couple years ago interpreted that to be basically at any outfall. So if you have different outfalls or points of discharge, I refer them as outfalls, but for the sake of this training, if I use the term outfall, it's the same thing as point of discharge. So if you have water leaving from one outfall one time, I have some clients where they have two different outfalls. One outfall, it rains, it flows. I have another outfall, it takes a lot of rain till the water builds up and then eventually flows. So I have some clients where they have a giant vault in the ground, and I got them out of the permit because they didn't require permit coverage, and so I was able to get them out. But at the time when they were under the permit, they had a giant 10,000 gallon vault, a concrete vault in the ground, and they'd have tank farms that would feed into that vault. Well, everybody else would be grabbing samples, you know, the day of the rain, and their tank farms all cascaded down and came to this one point. So for them, they had tank farms that were not impervious, so water would soak in, and so it took water a while to sponge down and to make it to that vault. But eventually, usually at the end of a storm event, or maybe the next day, as the water would sponge off from all those different areas and go into the vault, it would fill to the point where it needed to be discharged. So for them, a QSE didn't start until the next day. So I'd come out there, the sun's shining, the birds are singing, and I'm grabbing a stormwater sample because they opened the valve and let the water go. So that's when flow started. So something that I say that kind of makes people turn their heads is stormwater is not based on rain, it's based on discharge, it's based on flow. You're going to have rain without flow, but you can't have flow without rain. Okay, so you have to have enough flow to where you can get a sample bottle in there and collect the sample. If the water hits the drain and just kind of crawls along the side and you can't, and you have to scrape or get, that's not enough flow to collect the sample. It has to be enough flow to where you can get in there and grab a sample. And two, it has to have 40 hours since the last discharge ended. Okay, so if it rains on a Monday and then it rains again on Tuesday, and you're able to, and you had discharge on Monday, you can't grab a sample the next day again because it hasn't been 48 hours since the last discharge ended. So a qualifying, or QSE as we call it, has to have flow and 48 hours. Okay, flow and 48 hours. And again, flow is if you have a valve system, if you capture all your water, Flow is when you open that valve. If you open that valve, that's flow. I have a client in Pittsburgh where they have a huge yard and they have a huge containment, and their yard fills up, and then they let the water settle out in their pond first, and then they pump it through a separator and then to go. Okay, that's awesome. Their numbers have always been terrific because they have filtration socks in place. The water filters through. The water ponds out, and so basically they have a great system. They've always been very clean, and so their numbers have always been terrific. But for them, 90% of the time, they don't even have a discharge until the next day or a couple of days later because they have such a huge yard. So again, qualified summer event. I know I keep going back to this, but people, just remember, flow in 48 hours since the last discharge. Flow in 48 hours. Okay. You only need a sample if there's a discharge. If there's no discharge, sampling is not required. I have a client this past year where they had management from another state, and my client didn't have a discharge, but they got calls from offsite management saying, "You need to grab a sample. You're supposed to grab a sample. You know, you're supposed to grab samples 4 times a year and all that stuff." And they were like, "Okay, but I don't think we're supposed to." They should have called me. I would have been able to give them a better education, but they didn't. But anyway, so they grabbed the sample. And they grabbed samples from standing water that was sitting in the middle of some equipment, so it had iron in it. And so now they have issues with iron and zinc, which if the water had left their property, it would have gone through their BNPs, and it would have been just fine. Okay, so you don't grab samples from water unless it's discharging or leaving your property and going to the surface waters of the United States. This is the surface waters permit. Okay, it's not talking about groundwater; it's talking about surface waters. Now, that being said, quick caveat: you're not allowed to contaminate groundwater. That's a whole other set of regulatory issues there. I'm talking about the surface water. So unless you have water leaving your property and going to an MS4 to a storm and drain system of some sort, or going to the surface water of the United States, and if it leaves your property, it's a discharge. If it doesn't leave your property, it's not a discharge. Don't grab a sample until you actually have flow leaving your property. Okay. Collecting samples. You're required to collect samples. You're required to collect a QSE, a qualified summer event. Okay, but wait a minute, how many samples am I supposed to collect? You're required to collect samples within the first 4 hours of the start of discharge. Okay, so we're talking about how many. You're supposed to do 4 a year, first and 2 half and second half, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, but first of all, let's talk about when a QSE happens and you see there's flow, not just rain, but there's flow. So again, it can rain for a while and there's no flow, but once you see flow starting, from that point forward, that's when the clock starts. So if rain occurs and flow starts during your business hours, you have up to 4 hours from the start of discharge to collect that sample. So let's just say your hours are Monday through Friday, 7 to 4. Okay, and rain starts. It's been raining off and all day, but you look at the drains, you look at your outfalls, and nothing's leaving. Then later in the day, the rain starts to pick up or it's steady, and then you notice your outfalls, flow starts, and then there's enough flow to where you go, I can grab a sample of that. When the water reaches that point where it's leaving, that's the point at which discharge starts. So that's when the clock starts ticking. So if discharge occurs during your regular scheduled business hours, from the point it starts, you have up to 4 hours to collect that sample. Okay? Or, and this is the one I prefer, because I tell clients you get what I call the first flush. You lose the first flush, which is good. You may collect within the first 4 hours of the start of business if a QC, if a storm or discharge occurred in the previous 12 hours. So what? Let's go with that again. Okay. If you open Monday through Friday, 7 to 4, and the night before, around midnight, rain started, and if you look at the rain gauges, now my preference is to have a rain gauge on site that you can connect to via the internet. That way you can see for yourself on your site, because there could be a rain gauge a couple blocks away from you, and they could have had rain and you couldn't. And so it's better. I recommend getting a rain gauge that you can connect to offsite for yourself. But anyway, if you look at the rain gauges either by your facility or on your facility, and you see that, oh man, we had X number of rain. Most facilities, if you're completely paved, it takes about 1/10 of an inch or more. Every facility is different. But if you determine, yes, we had flow somewhere around midnight. Okay, if you open up at 7, then you know that you had flow within 12 hours of the opening of your business. Okay, so you come in the next day at 7 o'clock, and there's flow. You can grab a sample. In fact, you have up to the first 4 hours at the start of business. So if rain starts the night before and flow is generated the night before, you come in the next day and it's still raining and you have flow, you can collect the sample as long as it's up to 11 o'clock, right? 7, 8, 9, 10, 8 to 9 to 10 to 11. So the first 4 hours to start a business, okay? So within the first 4 hours of business, you can grab a sample. For example, if it rained the night before and you can see that, oh, we had flow last night, but it's not raining when you come in at 7, but then an hour or two later, rain picks up and starts to flow after that again. As long as it's within the first 4 hours to start a business, you can collect that sample. So let's recap. If rain starts during your regular scheduled business hours and it's a QSE, and what's a QSE again? Flow in 48 hours since the last discharge. Okay, so if it's a qualifying summer event, if it's a QSE and you have flow during regular scheduled business hours, then you have up to 4 hours from the start of discharge to grab a sample. Or, excuse me, or if rain started the night before and you come in the next day and you have flow and you know it started with it, if the discharge from the night before happened within 12 hours of the start of your business, in other words, if it started anytime after 7 o'clock the night before, as long as it's within 12 hours from the start of business, you have up to 4 hours from the time you open to grab a sample if you have a discharge, okay? Now, my preference is the second one because you've had a whole night of wash off and there's a lot of people around you. There's a lot of businesses around you. There's a lot of sources for pollutants that go up in the air and land on your property. So basically what you're doing is you're allowing their water to leave your property first. And then what's left is what represents your quality of your water, okay?
Aaron,
you're not changing. Yes.
we have a question. Are
Yes.
these rules for a specific state? That's from Derek.
California. This is the California Industrial General Stormwater Permit. Granted, it's based on the multi-sector permit, which is put up by the federal government. However, California years ago applied for and was accepted to run their own NPDES program. And so it is a state issued permit with federal backing. So these rules and this permit is for facilities who are under permit coverage in the state of California. Good question. Thanks, Rebecca. Feel free to cut at any time on the chat, guys, and Rebecca will bring it to my attention. I'll be glad to answer it. So moving along, collecting samples. You're not required to grab samples during dangerous weather conditions. So if you're gonna grab a sample and there's like fork lightning hitting around, or if we have a mega storm and if you're next, especially like I have some clients where they're near a river and it's overflowing and it's not safe, you're not required to grab samples. Okay, so if there's dangerous conditions, or say there's water spouts or monitoring. I know when I used to live in Southern California, once in a while, especially in Long Beach, somewhere down there, once in a while they'd have minor tornadoes down there. If you have that kind of weather, then that's not safe conditions. Okay, and if it's not safe, even though it may be a QSC and even though you may have discharge, if it's not safe, you want to document that though. You want to say, listen, we had a QSC on this day, but it wasn't safe, and here's why. Okay. If sample may be collected during QSC outside scheduled business hours, but it's not required. And I want to tell you, I recommend that you don't collect samples outside your business hours. The permit allows you to collect QSCs if it's a qualified storm event, but really it's not really even a QSC, because the definition of a QSC is it has to have enough flow to collect the sample, and 2, has to be since 48 hours since the last time you had a discharge. Well, QSCs they only happen during regular scheduled business hours. Okay, you're only required to collect them during regular scheduled business hours. So I've been to some clients where they were eager to get their samples in, and so they took time out of their own schedule to come in on a Saturday or come in on a Sunday to collect the sample. And later on, a third party, a non-governmental institution, will come in and sue them on behalf of the environment. I'll leave it there. And they say, hey, you know, how come you didn't get your 4 samples this year? And they'll say, well, I didn't have a QSC during business hours. Say, really? Well, 2 years ago, you grabbed a sample on a Saturday. You don't want to set a precedence that someone, which I will give my opinions of them myself, someone might use against you. So you're not required to come back on business hours. So why is that rule there? Well, the water board did that on purpose. They don't want you to have to come back from your Christmas vacation or your Thanksgiving vacation, or come back on New Year's to come grab samples. You know, if you're closed, that's not regular scheduled business hours. If you're closed for the holidays, it's not regular scheduled business hours. You're not required to collect the sample. Okay, so if a discharge happens overnight but it doesn't happen while you're there, or it doesn't fit that 12-hour rule, or if it happens off hours on the weekend or on holidays, you're not required to come back and grab those samples. Okay, You're only required to grab samples when they're qualified storm events and they happen during regular scheduled business hours. Now, if you're a 24/7 facility, then all the time is your scheduled business hours. And here's one thing that I'm going to quick note on. You can collect samples day or night. If samples happen in the middle of the night, if a QSC happens in the middle of the night, you can collect a sample and do your observations. Whereas the monthlies are only supposed to be done during daylight business hours on a day without rain. Many people get those two conflated. The monthlies are separate from the stormwater observations. Monthlies are dry weather, daylight inspections. Stormwater is especially if you're 24/7 facility, when discharge happens and it's a qualified storm event, collect that sample and do your observations, day or night, okay? How many samples do I need to collect? And here's where I get into that, okay? You're required to grab 2 samples the first half of the reporting year, which is between July through December 31st, and 2 qualifying storm events the second half of the reporting year between January 1st and June 30th. Note that I put 2 QSEs. If you don't have a qualifying storm event, if you don't have a discharge of water off your property, it's not a QSE to you and you don't have to grab a sample. I have a lot of clients where they have containment. And for them, it takes a lot of water to collect the sample. In fact, I have a client in Oakdale, they have a big old monster pond, and since I've been helping them for years, they have never had a discharge. All their water goes to that pond isn't even close to filling up. They don't fit the NOAA requirements, but I'm sure they probably fit at each percentile. I mean, the pond is huge, and they're never even come close to having a discharge. So they have never grabbed samples, and not because they're screwed in the law, but because they don't have a discharge. Remember, this is a surface water permit. So last year, for example, we had a very severe drought year. From the clients, we have 1 client left that we're helping to sample, and we only had 1 storm event in the first half of the year. It happened in November of last year, where we were able to grab a sample for them the first half of the year. Okay, and the second half of the year we will get 2 more. I think we only got 1, maybe 2 samples. I think we got the 2 samples the second half of the year, but for sure we only got 1 in the first half because there wasn't any other qualifying storm events. Some storms came in on the weekend, some came in overnight, some came in, stuff like that. And we were watching. So again, you grab 2 samples. So if you have 4 QSCs, 2 the first half and 2 the second half, collect a sample. Okay. If you only have 1, which happens a lot, especially if you have only 1 sample, or even if you have no samples the first half of the year, because for whatever reason there wasn't a qualifying discharge, then you just need to explain in your annual report, listen, we were watching, we were tracking, but there was no discharges the first half of the storm year. And especially last year, it's pretty easy to prove. I mean, we had a very, very dry year last year.
Aaron, we have another question.
Yeah.
This one's from Kristen. She asks, if the facility is open 24/7, but the environmental group is only working weekdays, do we need someone outside the environmental department to get a sample within 4 hours of discharge?
Sadly, yes. That is, if it's 24/7 and they're doing industrial activity. For example, if you're open 24/7, but you're during certain times of that night, they're not doing any production, they're just doing equipment maintenance or something like that. That's outside your regular scheduled business hours. When they say 24/7, if you're a facility where they're doing production or they're doing manufacturing 24/7, then yes, someone needs to be able to collect a sample within that 24-hour period. So I hope that answers your question. The answer is, if you have industrial activities that qualify for exposure and you're outside, you're required to grab a sample. Many times people will say, well, we're open 24/7, but our office staff is only here Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. So let's reput. I understand that, but the bottom line is the permit's pretty clear. If you have industrial activity, you need to be able to grab a sample. So to answer your question, if there's industrial activity, then yes, someone should be able to grab a sample in the middle of the night. So you might want to train 1 or 2 people during those shifts, if possible, just in case. That's a good question. I get that a lot during training. And the unfortunate answer is, if you have industrial activity, yes. So moving on. So great question, by the way. Thank you. Excellent question. So 1, if you're a regular facility and you're not part of a compliance group, you're supposed to grab 4 a year if there's qualifying discharges. Okay. Now, if you're part of a compliance group, you're only required to grab 2 samples a year, one the first half of the year and one the second half of the year. Okay. So in compliance groups, they have advantages. They have some disadvantages. There used to be compliance groups of a type under the old permit, but I didn't like the way it was set up back then. Compliance groups are actually better, I think, under the way it's constituted in this new permit. It's supposed to be led by a qualified stormwater, the QISP, qualified stormwater practitioner, and also industrial practitioner. And the good thing about it is if the QISP is not doing his job or her job, they can be removed from that position. So there's accountability. I like that. So if you're a regular facility, like most people are, for a year, if you have qualified storm events, 2 the first half, 2 the second half. If you're in a compliance group, you're only required to grab 1 sample the first half of the year and 1 sample the second half of the year. Okay. Continuing on with how many collected. According to the permit, in fact, basically, for QSI, again, we talked about this. If you don't have it, you're not required to come back and try to make up for it. So for example, last year, I have a lot of clients who either didn't get any samples at all the first half of the year, or between July and December of 2020. And then some only got 1. They're like, well, do I need to grab 3 samples the second half of the year? No, you don't have to make up for sampling because that's only if but again, now with that being said, if I had a shot at grabbing a sample the first half of the year and I said, I don't want to grab the first one because it's the dirtiest one, I'll just wait for the next 2 to come along. Well, you're never guaranteed 2 qualifying storm events anyway. I mean, look at last year, we hardly got any rain. So you do need to collect the sample. If you have a discharge, you really should grab that sample because you may not be good a shot at a second one. And if you let a QSC go by and you don't grab a sample, then you come in the first half of the year, you're like, you have to explain your annual report why it is you didn't collect the sample like you're supposed to. Okay. And then you're supposed to put procedures in place and basically do something to say, hey, we're not going to let this happen again. However, if you only grab 1 sample the first half of the year because you only had 1 QSC, you don't have to make it up. Okay. The only time I recommend people taking up more than 1 is if they blew it the first half of the year, they say, well, it might be a good idea to grab 3 the second half of the year. Plus, if their BMPs are doing a good job and they're at a level 1 or level 2 and their BMPs are doing a good job, I say maybe you might consider grabbing a few extra samples so you can work them into your annual evaluation or annual assessment and see if you can get down back to baseline. But those are special cases that you should probably talk to a QISP about. But again, you don't have to make up for missed discharges if you didn't have a QSC. Okay, if you did, then you might consider it.
Aaron, we have another question from Cindy.
Yes.
If the facility doesn't discharge, how many times should there be an observation to prove that per stormwater year?
That is more pertinent this year than ever. That's an excellent question, and I need to speak to that. There is a certain third-party group right now that's going around suing everybody and their mother. Okay, and in California, I have a saying: when it comes to the environment, you're guilty until proven innocent. Sadly, so what I recommend, especially if you're a facility like the one I have in Oakdale, whenever there's a rain, I would just go out there and do observations to confirm there's no discharge. And before you close at the end of the day or whatever, if you still see things build up, I would take a picture and document that, saying, look, this is not required by the permit, but we need some insurance because you have third parties out there that are making false assumptions about people. They're making assumptions that aren't true. And so it's better to be safe than sorry. So does the permit require that? No. The permit only requires you to do observations of discharges when you grab a sample, okay? However, I say, especially if you don't discharge, every time you have a serious, if it's a minor rain, it's no big deal. But if you have a rain where, we get a good amount of rain, I would just take a photo document and document date and time and say, look, I took a picture, this date and time, look, water didn't leave our property, our valve was closed. Or unless you have some electronic system where it shows valving open or closing, where you can prove that water didn't leave. So I hope that's helpful. That's an excellent question. And the answer is the permit requirement? No. Does self-protection requirement? I would just take a quick picture. And this internal documentation, by the way, it's internal. You want to keep it to yourself. And the only time you need to pull this out is if you have some third party who decides they want to relieve you of your money. So that's my recommendation. Good question.
Looks like she has a comment in addition to that. I'm in
Yes.
rainy North Northern California on the coast, this is a lot of observations.
It is. Unfortunately, now my question is, if you have free flowing water, in other words, if you have a discharge point where it just builds up and flows, it'll be more work for you because you have to constantly be out there checking it. But what I would do is basically, especially towards the end of your day, I would leave, if you're leaving for the end of the day, I would take a shot or just do an observation. Even if you don't take a picture, just do a documented observation, something saying, hey, I looked at this day and this time, nothing. Maybe just have a log sheet or something so that anybody who's there at the end of the day can just do a quick look and then say, check the log, no discharge. Something to, you don't necessarily always have to take a picture, but just something to say, hey, look, I looked at this, there's no discharge. And maybe consider taking a picture on heavy rain days. For example, say we have a rain where we had like maybe an inch or more of rain, that's pretty heavy. Maybe that's a day you might want to take a picture to prove you're not discharging. But yeah, there's a lot. Now, if you have a capture system, like a pond or something where you have valves and you have a valve log, especially if you have an SBCC plan where you open logs and things go, that's your proof that, hey, we had no discharge because nothing leaves unless we open the valve. And so you can have a valve log that says, hey, this valve only opens to discharge and this valve did not get opened this whole half the year. That's proof that you didn't discharge because everything goes to there and it was valve closed. So I hope that's helpful. Good question. These are excellent questions. Again, folks, you have to protect yourself against people who would assume things that aren't true. So that's what you want to do. So under the Industrial General Stormwater Permit, there are 3 sampling constituents or parameters, whatever term you want to use, that facilities must analyze for. What are those 3 things you need to sample for? pH. This is the measurement of the acidity in water. There's the official definition. Basically, is the water acidic or is the water, alkaline? Basically, you have a range between 6 and 9 pH units, and it requires that you keep your water within that 6 to 9 pH range. With this being said, there are some TDLs that are coming for people that basically may change this. But if there's no TDL requirement, that's what your average is. You need to keep between 6 and 9 pH units. So everybody needs to sample for pH. Everybody, no matter who you are, if you have a discharge, you need to sample for total suspended solids. Kind of like a snow globe. If you ever shake a snow globe and you see all this stuff floating in the water, it's not like sugar or salt where when you put it into solution, it disappears and dissolves. It's those things that don't dissolve, thus suspended solids. So you have pH you have to look for, total suspended solids, and also oil and grease. And everybody needs to look for oil and grease. So those are the 3 things that, even if you don't have to look for anything else, even if there are in the permit, there are different things that will qualify, that will require you to grab more samples of different things. But everybody, no matter who you are, if you have a facility that has water that discharges, you have to, at a minimum, look for these 3 things. Okay? But wait, there's more. Okay, I say that because I call this the infomercial permit. Every time you think you're done with a requirement, another requirement's lurking in the background. So everybody has to grab samples for the 3 basics. But like an infomercial, have you ever seen an infomercial where they say, we're selling you this brand new cup, it's the best cup ever, and we'll sell it to you for $19.95. But wait, there's more. If you buy today, we'll give you this, and they always have that. Okay. Well, with the general permit, it's the same thing. You're required to grab out 3 samples of pH, total suspended solids, oil, and grease. But wait, there's more. You have to grab samples from anything listed on table 1. So your SIC code, I mentioned it in the previous thing about facilities. They have a 4-digit code that describes their business type. If your SIC code is on table 1 and it tells you need a sample for extra stuff like COD, BOD, nitrates, zinc, iron, aluminum, whatever. If it adds whatever it adds to your sample regimen, you need to add that. So you have 3 basics plus anything listed on table 1. There is an exception to that, but I don't want to get into that now. 2, you need a sample for any potential pollutants that might be present in stormwater in your industrial facility. So if you're doing an industrial activity and it has a potential, not just directly, but if it has a potential to be in stormwater, you need to add that. So for example, say your SIC code only requires you to do the 3 basics, pH, oil, total suspended solids, oil, and grease. But you also know that you work with fertilizers on the side. Well, you need to add nitrates to your stormwater. Or if you know if you do a lot of a main part of your facility is cutting wood, then you need to add BOD, biochemical oxygen demand, to your list of sampling constituents. Okay, so you need to, 1, do 3 basics, 2, anything else that's on table 1, and 3, if you know of a type of pollutant from industrial activity you're working with that might be present, that's why you have to do a pollutant assessment. Okay, what's here, what's exposed to water. Does table 1 have this listed? No, but we know we have this in the water. Therefore, we need to add this to our sampling measurement. Applicable TMDLs. We talked about that. And that's attachment E of the facility. Southern California especially has a lot of TMDL issues now, especially with the new permit that came out in the amendments to the permit that came out in July 1st, 2020. A lot of problems with that. Also, if you have 303 of those items in the Clean Water Act, remember I told you this is a state issue permit with federal backing. Well, the Clean Water Act in Section 303D, it tells states that you're supposed to make a list of all the waters of your area, of your watersheds, and determine if they're impaired for beneficial uses or they have the potential to be impaired for beneficial uses. And they put a list of potential pollutants that might be causing an impairment, and they're supposed to do studies on that to show whether it's actually truly impaired or not. So they have a 303D list. There's a couple ways you can approach this. The permit has a link to a Excel spreadsheet where you can get the 303D list, or what you can do is you can go to your Smarts account and you can find it in your Smarts account under the requirements what the water board is expecting you to sample for, besides your 3 basics. So that can help you as well. Also, if you have ELGs, if you're an airport that does the icing, if you're a facility that does emulsion for asphalt, you're required to have additional effluent limitation guidelines, things like that. Okay, so there are different types of facilities. Power generation facilities have ELGs that apply to them. So different facilities, if they qualify, they will require to add ELGs to their facility. Okay. And if you have any TRI reporting chemicals, you're supposed to grab samples of those for well. The good news about the 303D listed items and the team and those, if you think, well, we might have them and you test for them and they're not present in stormwater, you can prove that they're not an issue, you can just continue something for them as long as you document that in your SWEP. Okay. Table 1, you're stuck with them unless the water board gives you a thumbs up that you can prove it's not an issue, but that's a whole nother process, which I don't want to get into. So you have to sample for 3 basics, you have to sample for everything on table 1, you have to sample for everything that might be present in stormwater. But again, from 2 on down, if you can show it's not, if you don't have, if for example, a lot of waterways here in the valley have nitrates, but if I have clients who have nothing to do with nitrates, they don't do anything with nitrates, then they don't have to sample for nitrates because they fabricate something else that doesn't have nitrates with it. Okay, so if you don't have any TDLs that match up, or 303 items, or if you don't have ELGs, or if you don't have TRIs, or if you do and you show that's not a problem, you can either not sample for them or discontinue sampling for them, but you have to justify it. So make sure that your QISP does a thorough pollutant assessment, and make sure you add what you need to, and then eliminate those which you're allowed to eliminate. The jump permit requires sampling results to be compared to discharge standards. Okay, and there's a couple of things. We have the numeric action levels, NELs. You have TNDLs, which have their NELs connected to it, so they're called TNLs. And you have numeric effluent limits, NELs. Okay, NELs are TMDLs are basically TNELs or NELs that are connected to the receiving water body. Okay, they're TNELs. So they'll be listed in attachment E of the permit. And then as well, NELs or numeric effluent limits are also listed in attachment E. If they apply to you, they'll be in attachment E of the permit. So let's talk about NELs first. NELs, you have 2 types. You have annual NEL exceedances, and you have instantaneous. Annual is what to do is you collect samples. Say you're able to get 4 samples this year, which I'm hoping we have enough rain to get 4 QSEs from everybody, because we really need rain. California is really in a heavy drought. So let's just say we get enough rain, you're able to get 4 QSEs. What you do is you add up all your discharges from all your outfalls and divide by the total number, and you get the average. Whatever the average is of that parameter, as long as it's below the average, you're safe. For example, total spent solids, the annual average is 100 milligrams per liter. Okay, so if you grab all your bunch of samples, add them up, and then divide, you get the average, and it's below 100, you're below the annual NEL. Okay, The instantaneous is if you have 2 samples that go above the instantaneous level, then you automatically go to level 1 at the start of the next reporting year. Okay, so for example, this year, if you have samples and you're over, you don't go to level 1 until after July 1st of 2022. It always kicks in the next year, the next reporting year. So if you have this year, if you have 2 samples, for example, if you have the most common instantaneous one that I find for people is pH. Okay, because pH is only instantaneous. It has no annual average NEL. It's only instantaneous. So if you have 2 pHs outside the range, sometimes I get clients who do that in one sample. They have one storm event and they have different outfalls, and 2 different outfalls have pHs outside the range. They're at level 1 at the end of the year. They're at the start of next year. They're at level 1 for pH. Okay, so instantaneous is if you have two ones that are above the instantaneous, then you go to level 1 if you're at baseline, or if you're at level 1, you go to level 2. Okay, for those parameters. NELs are targets to help facilities determine their discharge stormwater quality and response to with BNPs to improve the water quality. NELs are not violations of the general permit as long as the facility responds to the exceedances properly through general permit exceedance response actions process. Okay, so NELs are not a violation of the permit, and the permit says this, as long as you take the proper steps to respond to it. Okay, if you have NELs and you don't respond to it properly, you're going to be a violation of the permit. Okay, if you have NELs and you respond to it properly and put BNPs in place and you do an assessment and your stormwater starts to improve, then you are in compliance with the permit. TDLs, TNLs, some people say NLs, but I don't like the term. TNLs are like NELs in that they are targets to help the facility determine the discharge of water quality. Okay, however, they are based on the receiving water quality standards outlined in attachment E of the general permit. So you can find TNLs in attachment E of the general permit. And like NELs, they're not a violation of the permit as long as you respond with ERA response. So if you have a TNEL or an NEL, if you do the exceedance response actions, you can maintain compliance with the permit. Okay. TNL exceedances are applied like NEL instantaneous maximum NELs. There are no annual TNLs. So unlike NELs, though, TNLs are only instantaneous. They're not averages. So if you have 2 TNLs that are outside the permit level, then you're going to go to level 1 for that TNL, and you have to respond to it. Okay, and you have to do ERAs in response to that. Okay, they're only instantaneous. And ELs, I personally have an issue with NELs because I feel like you're not helping people to improve themselves. You're just spanking them without giving them a chance to improve themselves. But anyway, unlike NELs and TNLs, NELs are general permit limits and are a violation of the general permit and must be responded to in accordance with water quality-based corrective actions, as outlined in general permit section 20B. Okay, so if you have an NEL, which right now it's mostly Southern California and the Bay Area, or I believe, but for sure it's Southern California. If you have NELs, you have an exceedance for an NEL, you are in violation of the permit. Okay, NELs exceedances are applied like NELs and TNLs in that they are instantaneous maximums and have no annual values. Okay, but they are a violation of the permit. They are based on the receiving water quality standard outlined in attachment E. Okay, and being that they're a general permit violation, having an NEL makes a facility subject to penalties. Okay, so my understanding is, yeah, you are subject to penalties. So again, NEL, TNEL are not violations of the permit if you take the proper steps to respond to them. Okay, and NEL is a violation of the permit, and you're still required to respond to them and make them better. Okay, and I didn't go into it, but for the TNLs and NELs, they have compliance options to help people try to deal with those. That's actually a subject for a whole nother workshop, which I'm not sure if anybody's done one for the compliance options this year, but that'd be, if there is a workshop out there, you should probably attend it. Also, I know the water board has training concerning the amendments and in particular the compliance options, which are good to hear because that's an option for you. Many times what they're encouraging people to do to avoid the NELs is to basically try to consider putting in compliance options right away. You have on-site and off-site options, which again, I'm not going to go into detail because that's a whole nother subject, an hour subject in of itself. But that's there for you. And you can go into more detail. You can call us offline. We can help you out. Again, I recommend going to the water board's website and take a look at the workshops they did on the compliance options. They have some good online things there for you. Okay, we have looks like we have 5 minutes left. Do we have any other questions or anything on the chat, or would anybody like to unmute and ask a question? No more questions? And usually I get a lot of questions in this section because this is the one that's got the most to-do stuff on it. Well, as a quick reminder, again, I know I mentioned earlier, but just in case, if you go onto the Stormwater Awareness Stormwater Awareness Week, the website, and you go to the resources, you'll find a drop-down menu further down the page. And if you drop down to WGR, you'll see there that I created a certificate that you can download, a PDF that you can download and print up, and you can fill out if you attended today. Or if you like, these will be recorded online, so you can, when you do watch them, you can just document on that certificate when you watch them. And I also have the PowerPoint for all my trainings on that resource. That way you can print up the PowerPoints and have them for future review, or just keep them as proof of training along with your certificate.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you everyone for joining. This has been such a great time. And there is part 3 coming up at 1:30, I believe. Yes, 1:30. Yes. So head back to the website. You'll find the link to that. And then at 3 o'clock, we have the last workshop of Stormwater Awareness Week, which is going to be talking about where the event is going next. So if you're curious, you're going to want to join in on that workshop at 3. But thank you all for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.